If you think corporations bought free speech before, now that they're human, they'll buy even more. Yeah, their money has free speech to me quite.
Hello, and welcome to the Populist Dialogues, a project of the Alliance for Democracy. Our purpose is to advance the mission of the Alliance for Democracy to create a just society based on an equitable, sustainable economy. I'm your host, David Delk. Today we have video from an address recorded at the First Unitarian Church recently of an event sponsored by the Alliance for Democracy. The presenter is Thomas Linzey. Thomas is founder and chief spokesperson for Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund. CELDEF has moved from being a traditional environmental law firm to one which defends communities' rights by enacting community rights ordinances. Acting first in Pennsylvania to enact laws which forbid corporate farming, they have passed such ordinances in over 150 communities, including in Pittsburgh, where the City Council acted to ban fracking within their boundaries. Here is Thomas Linzey.
If you think corporations bought free speech before, now that they're human, they'll buy even more.
So we had to be dragged kicking and screaming into this process because folks had finally gotten to a point where they were willing to become disobedient enough to actually frontally disobey the law. Right? And that hasn't really happened in massive numbers for the past 120-some years. In fact, the last real movement that we had in the United States was probably the populist movement, late, took on the banking companies and the railroad corporations, actually the economic structure of stuff that was so basic in some ways to the country about who decides. You know, who decides on big issues like agriculture and transportation and energy. All those things have been centralized up, mostly to the federal government, some of the state government, but away from our hands. They don't want our digits anywhere near that stuff, right? They don't want us at the lower level making any of those kinds of decisions. But they want to centralize control over that stuff higher up. Hasn't happened in a long time in the United States, and there's almost been a Pavlovian system of punishment existing in the U.S. So when folks in the state of Virginia back in the 90s passed an out-of-state waste ban, to stop out-of-state waste from coming into Virginia and filling up their landfills. Radical idea. They wanted their own shit to fill their landfills rather than stuff from New York State and other places to come in. So they passed an out-of-state waste ban. We don't want your waste. The Supreme Court then declares that garbage is commerce under the Commerce Clause of the U.S. Constitution. Virginia is sued by Waste Management Corporation. They win, and the state has to pay them damages because they violated the corporation's Commerce Clause rights, right? Or the state of Iowa. Iowa gets sued by the Smithfield Foods Corporation. Iowa had this novel idea. They wanted to stop monopoly ownership over pork production so that companies couldn't both own the pigs and own the processing. Because when that happens, the corporation controls the entire process and is able to exercise monopoly control to gash farmers and push down the price and all that kind of stuff. Smithfield Foods Corporation sues contending that the law violates the Commerce Clause because pork production is commerce and wins, right? State of Vermont, people in Vermont to pass a VGH labeling law that they just want to know whether dairy, not very radical, we just want to know whether our dairy products that we're buying and consuming contain artificial bovine growth hormone, which is the stuff they shoot into cows to increase milk production. Right? Pretty simple. Well, the Grocery Retailers Association, of which Monsanto Corporation is a member, sues them, contends that their labeling law violates the corporation's right not to be compelled to speak under the First Amendment. Right? It wins. There are examples like that out the yin-yang. We've tracked down a couple hundred of these stories where people have tried. People have tried to do stuff over the years. There's many more stories like that. But it's Pavlovian because we get the shit beat out of us when the system punishes us for moving outside the very careful box that we've been allowed to exist in over the past 150 years. And that box, is very small. It's actually getting smaller by the day because they're even cutting off the regulatory stuff now. This may be off topic, but in Iowa, I was giving a talk, and people started talking about how they now go to state agency hearings. You know, where the agencies have hearings and you can go and talk about into the microphone. You know, don't worry, it's not connected, but they talk to the microphone anyway, and expect the agency to do X, Y, and Z for them. But they have a form, so you go and you testify. Well, about 2 years ago in Virginia, the State Department of Transportation decided that they didn't want rallies to be held in the form of those public comment hearings. So, you know, people go to the public comment thing to make trouble. They don't want the thing to come in. So that's the point of giving the comments. So the state agencies have gotten worried that it's like infectious. You know, somebody comes in and gives a comment, and people clap, it builds like this energy about people against the project that's coming. So now, when you give a comment, they actually give you a number at the door. You know, it's like being at the butcher shop where you take the number and you walk. And you go into a small room and you speak into a cone to give your comments. And they tape it. They then transcribe your comments, but it's intended so that nobody else can hear what you're saying in that room. And so it's like, how bad does it have to get before we begin to do something real? You know, that the insane begin to take over the asylum. Or as Janet Morris likes to say, she says, grab onto your purse, we're going over the wall. Because it seems to be that that's the place we're in, right? Where it's all a dog and pony show, and the stuff happens whether we want it to or not. And yet our activism is not really commensurate with the problems we now face in terms of the crises, whether it's a governing authority that we don't have, or the environmental problems that we face, or climate change, or any of this other stuff. We're still in the mode of let's write a letter to Congress, or let's hold a sign, or lead a protest, or buy a Prius, or change a light bulb, or do all the things that have been preset for us in some ways to exercise our powers as consumers, or become a stakeholder in the process, right? I guess I said this last night, I'll say it again, it's fun. I said last night that I'm getting really tired of people saying, well, we just want a seat at the table. That's all we want. You know, progressives, liberal. Well, all we want is a seat at the table. Well, I got news. We own the table. It's our table. Right? We own the chairs. We own the table. We own everything. It says so, right in our Constitution, right? It says we, the people, are the source of all governing authority. Wow. Okay. Well, that's what it says in words, but it certainly doesn't bear out that way. And so, in the system of law that we operate under, the structure of law that we obey, partly because there's this myth and camouflage that the founding fathers were the best people that ever trod the planet, they're the best and brightest people that ever trod the planet, and that they set up a system of law that's a democracy, and so it's our fault when we lose, right? When we have these battles and we lose, because then we say to ourselves, well, we just need to get a couple more people out of the demonstration, or we just needed a couple more letters in the mail, we needed another microphone, or we needed a better flip chart, or we needed this or that. We actually blame ourselves for the loss when the structure is really rigged, and we've been sugared. And the question, and of course our work, and Paul's work in Oregon, and the folks that are doing the work in Yam Hill, and Justine, and Ben in Lane County in Oregon, which is very exciting stuff, are finally saying, no, we're not going to do it anymore. For 40 years, 50 years, 60 years, 70 years, we've had this vision, a sustainable vision for the places where we live. But we're no closer to actually implementing that vision through law than we were 60 years ago, or 70 years ago. We've had stuff sitting on the shelves, gathering dust. We figured it out academically, how you do it, how you have sustainable energy and sustainable agriculture. There's no secret in what the systems require, what the systems look like. We just have never had the legal or political authority to actually drive them into law, because they violate counter rights that have been established in law and concocted and manufactured for us over the past 150 years. And so we're stuck, right? We've been stuck for a while. And meanwhile, we're on the edge and in fact crossing over into ecological collapse. I mean, the United Nations came out a week ago and said this is a major planetary catastrophe that we are now facing because of the actions that we've taken across the globe. And so in the United States, the structure of law is that we're in a box. Our activism has been boxed in. And on each side of the box is different legal doctrines that have been concocted over the years to keep us in that box. One is corporate personhood, one is corporate commerce clause rights, which we talked about. Another one is Dillon's rule, and then preemption. They because nothing really happens in those meetings anyway, because nothing's supposed to happen in those meetings, because the structure's been built the way it is. So the major question that we began to ask in these communities that we were assisting in Central Pennsylvania began to ask is, can we build sustainability, economic and environmental sustainability, while operating within that box that has been designed for us? Because if we can, then we can all go home. I mean, it's only 7 o'clock and, football's on. And so we can go home because there's no need to talk about other stuff. But if we come to the conclusion that those doctrines actually prevent us from building the type of system that we need to build, and actually stopping those from harming us who are using those doctrines to do so, then we've got a lot of work ahead of us, because we have to dismantle that system and actually create one from almost scratch, right? That's the job that's ahead of us. And so, what does that look like? Well, in 2001, some small municipalities in Pennsylvania began to ban corporate farms. And then, because the conversation began to turn to corporations, because guess what? 4 corporations in the United States control 70% of pork production in the United States. 1 corporation controls 60% of cheese production. It's Kraft. 5 corporations control 70% of chicken production in the United States. So instead of fighting over parts per million or air pollution or water pollution, the types of things that we talk about when we deal with factory farms or other things coming in, which are all really symptoms of something larger, that maybe, just maybe, we should start going upstream and figuring out why those things are happening in the first place and who's making the decisions that affect our communities in an adverse way. And that actually means looking in the agriculture field, at least at the corporatization of agriculture, because that's what we've had over the past 40, 60 years. Our agricultural system has been corporatized. We've lost 600,000 family farmers in the United States. And we always use the word lost. It's very passive. It's like we can't find them. We've been looking for them, but we can't find them. Well, they've been driven out of business by a thoroughly corporatized system. If you want to do pork production in the United States, if you want to raise pigs in a commercial sense, you can't do it independently anymore and actually get those hogs to market, because all those vehicles have been shut down. And they've been shut down by these direct contracts that corporations make with the farmers. They're called output contracts, whereby hogs are raised. And again, a little bit tangential, but we'll touch on it anyway. What do those contracts do? Well, they turn ownership of the farm animals over to the corporation under the agreement. Unless the animal dies, and then title reverts back to the farmer. Actually dispose of the animal. In addition, the corporation shifts all environmental liability to the farmer to get rid of the environmental liability that might otherwise fall on the corporation. Because they used to buy farms themselves. You used to be driving down the road and see a Smithfield Foods sign, or see a Hatfield Foods sign, where they actually bought farms. The problem is, they understood at some point that buying farms meant that liability flowed with that ownership. So they came up with a new ownership system that, in essence, now transfers all that environmental liability onto the farmers. So it's almost like a serf relationship that farmers have been yanked into. And to make it worse, they now take farmers into these output contracts and, in essence, force them to put other family farmers out of business, because they become a part of the machine that is then thrusting other farmers out of business, because it's creating a marketplace that the other farmers can't compete in. It's like the nastiest of stuff happening, right? It's all under the covers, pretty much. Although China is now taking everybody from the rural areas to drive into the cities, because the Chinese understand that industrialization, full industrialization, means you got to get people off the land and you got to stick them into the cities and the factories, right? Which was a nasty little secret about our economic program back in the 20s and the 30s, where we did exactly the same thing, which was to drive farmers off the land. Doesn't sound very sustainable to me. And so, with South Central PA municipalities starting to pass these corporate anti-corporate farming laws, a conversation that started to bubble up in central Pennsylvania. And that conversation wasn't bubbling up from liberal progressive communities. Central Pennsylvania is rural, conservative. These are the guys with the shit kickers and the John Deere hats, somebody said belt buckles that would make a Texan proud. These are the folks in these rural communities trying to fight these factory farms off. And the conversation was, we need to stop these things coming in, but we need to do it in a structural way. One that actually goes after the source of the problem rather than the symptom stuff. And to this day, I look back and I remember, I have some memories, some fond and others, of us traveling the state, talking to groups of municipal officials all across the state about these issues, about corporate farming, or passing local ordinances and doing that kind of work. And I used to tell them, but you have to be careful because even if you pass these ordinances, they can be challenged. You get sued by the agribusiness corporations because corporations have constitutional rights. And we would go into that. We'd say, here's all the rights that they have. Here's how they got them. And we know all this stuff because we're lawyers, right? And we studied it. And we know it. We're the learned folks about all this stuff. We were telling them about corporate rights and that their ordinance can be overturned. And by and large, all the municipal officials and the communities we were working with, their eyes would glaze over. And they would say, well, that might be something you learned in law school or in history class or grade school or someplace like that. But it's all academic to us because we live in a democracy. And we've come together and we've passed this law and we're going to enforce this law. And it's a democracy, which means we have the right to do that. Don't bother us with that corporate rights stuff. We don't understand it. We're not going to take the time to understand it. We just don't get it, and it all sounds very academic to us. All right. So countless meetings after countless meetings after countless meetings trying to talk to people about corporate rights stuff as the superstructure of law and deal with it. Didn't work. Couldn't get the message through. We weren't well known enough to have people listen to us as experts or anything. And so we waited. Right? We just waited. These ordinances kept multiplying. Eventually we had 100 communities in Pennsylvania, about a tenth of all the rural municipal townships in Pennsylvania, who had now passed these different kinds of laws, which went out to the corporations directly. Lo and behold, one of the small municipalities in central Pennsylvania got a knock on the door one morning, and the knock was from the sheriff, the local sheriff. And he was serving a complaint on the municipality. The municipality had been sued. So the local township officials got a copy of the complaint, looked at it. Sure enough, on page 1, it said, "We are an agribusiness corporation. We are persons under the law. And you have violated, by passing this anti-corporate farming law, our 14th Amendment rights to equal protection of the law." 14th Amendment equal protection says, as persons, all persons have a right to equal application and protection of the laws. The lawsuit said, we are corporate persons, and your law discriminates against us because it bans corporate farmers, but doesn't ban family farmers from engaging in farming. And because you've distinguished the two within your law, you've now violated our constitutional rights to equal protection under the Constitution. Right? And so I got a call from one of the supervisors, one of the township officials, and he said, now we understand what you've been trying to tell us, right? But we didn't have the battery power to do it. We actually had to provoke a response to come in the door to prove what we had predicted, to actually make it real to folks, because everything is so camouflaged and hidden that we actually needed the power of the system to kick back to do our organizing for us. It was almost like the first time we began to understand how to use the energy of the existing system to actually forward the organizing that needed to happen along these lines. So what happened next? Well, those supervisors became famous. And these 100 municipalities that had been talking about these issues for a while, because they had been lawmaking in a different way, not about the symptoms, but about the corporations, then began to talk about this case that the corporations had brought against the municipality and the corporate rights that were used against the municipality. And so there was even more interest in these places about doing something about not just the corporate farms, but something structural. And so we began talking to groups, and at the one meeting I remember the guy in the back, John Deere hat and everything, he stood up and he said, well, Mr. Linzey, what good does it do to pass these ordinances if corporate rights can then be used to actually come in and strike them down? We can get sued by a corporation. And I said, well, that's what we've been telling you for years. Haven't you been listening? And he said, yes, we have been listening. And he said, we want to take a step forward and actually do something more. And I said, well, what could possibly be more? You're already taking on the corporate farmers, the largest corporations in the United States and globally on food production. This folks are standing up. I said, what do you want us to do? And he said, we want you to draft us an ordinance that refuses to recognize corporate constitutional rights within our municipality. Okay. And I said, you can't do that. My first response, you can't do that. Right? And he said, well, we don't feel we have a choice. It's either that or throw in the towel and allow these boys to come in because we're not insulating our ordinances properly. In other words, that's how they saw it in this logical thought progression they were going through. Not only do we have to pass these laws, but we have to enforce them, and we can't enforce them if corporate rights are a superstructure that come in to actually not allow us to enforce them. It's very clear, logical thinking, which was opposite of what we were using when we say, you can't do it. And he said, well, work with us, and we don't know whether we'll eventually pass it. We got to talk to constituents and have meetings and advertise and all that kind of stuff. I said, well, that sounds like fun. And so we went back to the office, at that point completely disillusioned with the regulatory process, and took the lead with them. And we drafted the nation's first corporate rights elimination ordinance that actually stripped corporations, and we increasingly don't use the word strip because we don't think they're legitimate in the first place, and so refused to recognize these claims to corporate constitutional rights within their municipality. And we handed it off to them, a little place called Licking Township in Clarion County, just north of Pittsburgh. And they advertised it, actually appeared in the newspaper, and the newspaper didn't catch on fire. Then had an actual public hearing, public meeting to actually consider the passage of the ordinance. And we drove up, 2-hour drive, we weren't going to miss it for the world. I sat in the back, and they had, just to set the scene, these rural municipalities in Pennsylvania, they don't have enough funding to actually have a building of their own. So they need the salt shed, where the salt is piled up in the middle for winter, because the elected officials actually drive the machines. They drive the trucks to drive the salt on the road. And so, you have a light bulb hanging from the ceiling, swinging back and forth like that horror movie. And then you have people set up on folding chairs around the salt mound, essentially. What happened that night was a conversation I couldn't have and still can't have with most of my lawyer peers because it's beyond them. But in that room that night, farmers showed up in that building with copies of Tom Paine's Common Sense that they had downloaded from the internet and actually read it into the record that was being kept in the public hearing. Other folks showed up with Article 1, Section 1 of the Pennsylvania Constitution. It says the people are the source of all governing authority. And asked questions like, well, if we're the source of all governing authority, what gives Waste Management Corporation or Senator Corporation or the other corporations the power to come in and actually tell us we can't do what we need to do to protect our own health, safety, and welfare? How is that possible? And the conversation I heard that night was simply astounding to me. And then the supervisors, the three of them, voted unanimously to become the first municipality in the United States to actually refuse to recognize corporate constitutional rights within their municipality. No place to live in Township. Well, the township next door got interested because they were having sludge shipped in from Philadelphia because Philadelphia sludge doesn't stay in Philadelphia. Philadelphia sludge comes out to the rural areas and gets dumped, so that kind of stuff happens with waste and other things in areas that can't protect themselves. And so the township next door was affected by sewage sludge, and they saw what Licking Township done, and they went ahead and passed it as well. This ordinance dealing with corporate constitutional rights. And then the work got really interesting, because then we started getting called into these other places in Pennsylvania, these municipalities, mostly very small. The first municipality to pass anything was 450 people, so just to give you an idea of size. And the conversation started to spread across the state, so that more and more municipalities began to pass these laws, and pretty soon we were at 10% of all rural municipalities in the state that had begun to adopt these kinds of laws, which frontally challenged the authority of corporations to make decisions about agriculture and energy and transportation in some places and those types of things. What happened next was the legislature intervened and actually floated a bill that would have created a criminal sanction, in essence, against municipalities that had adopted any of these ordinances. So it'd be nice to imagine we live in a country where the legislature would say, oh, that's wonderful what those folks are doing in stopping those corporations from coming in. And then said, what can we do to help you people in those municipalities? But instead, the track record, of course, is that the legislature operates in the opposite manner, which is to actually work in concert, wholly owned in some ways, with the corporations to begin to gut the municipalities by putting preemption laws in place and those other kinds of things. Fought that sucker for 6 years and stopped it cold in the legislature and did a lot of lobbying, which you guys are probably going to do over the next 2 weeks, I would imagine, trying to get the legislators to do the right thing. And in the end, the legislature didn't do the right thing after 6 years. And they passed this god-awful thing of a bill called ACRE. It stands for Agriculture, Communities, and Rural Environment. And what does ACRE do? It allows corporations that are affected by these ordinances to, instead of suing, which they were doing before, hiring a lawyer and chasing after each one, they can now pick up the phone and call call the Attorney General of Pennsylvania and have the Attorney General's office threaten the municipality that if they don't overturn the ordinance, that the state is going to sue them. Not the corporation, but the state using your taxpayer monies to do so, right? Almost privatizing the Attorney General's office to service those corporations, to come in and quell the revolt that was starting to happen, but calling in state power to do that. Which a lot of people said at that period of time, oh my God, we're so sorry, that this is now ended, that you guys made a run and you got shut down by the legislature. To which we look back and say, I think this is great. And it's great because in those places where we're working, just like we tried to convince people that corporate rights were an issue, we were talking to people about the fact that the only way the corporations are able to do what they do is because they're enabled by the system of law and the state government to do it. So they're not called permits for nothing. They actually permit the activity to occur, and they're handed out like hotcakes by the state legislature and by the state agencies. So the problem we face is not the corporation. When the communities rise up to do something, they don't meet the corporation first. They actually meet our structure of law first. The problem is not corporations. The problem is that we live in a corporate state, right? Where the corporate boys, the minority of people that run them, actually control our state government and control the federal government to some extent. That they're actually the ones pulling the strings, making decisions. And that we're on the receiving end of all that. And by and large, when we gave those talks to communities, their eyes would glaze over. And they'd say, well, the problem is not our government. The government's neutral. The government's neutral. And they make reasoned decisions, and they do this and do that. And the problem is not our government. The problem is the corporations trying to put stuff in. And we would say, no, because for the corporation to come in, it's actually enabled and accelerated by that governmental system, because it's all one unit pretty much under this corporate state. And they'd say, you're a radical dude, man, because that's really, that's so anti-democracy. What you're saying, if that's real, then that means we don't have democracy operating here. It's like, yeah, you're starting to, cross that line into that area. And so when these municipalities continued passing laws, because the new law didn't stop them, they actually kept doing it, is that the Attorney General's office dispatched assistant attorney generals to actually physically come to the meetings where ordinances had been passed in these municipalities, and he would stand. I take that back. Usually they tried to get an executive session to get it out of the public eye so that the Attorney General's office could put pressure on the municipal officials behind closed doors rather than out in the public. We had a sit-in happen at one of the municipal governments where they wouldn't allow the executive session that took place. We had 4 people sit into the private room to not allow the Attorney General's office to meet with the public officials. And he gave this speech about how, if folks didn't repeal this, that the state was going to sue them, and it wasn't anything personal, it was just the law. And the people in the community said, well, we take that very personally, because you're talking about our health, safety, and welfare, and using our municipality as a laboratory, for testing stuff that we don't know anything about. And the 2 women there, who were part of the organized group that actually put the ordinance in the first place, physically escorted the Assistant Attorney General out of the municipal room to his car, saying things like, well, thank you for coming, we appreciate it, but we don't really need your help here because we've stopped sludge from coming in and we can protect our health, safety, and welfare with our lawmaking. And thank you very much, but have a good trip back here. Turns out there was an Associated Press reporter who covered the event, and he got this great snapshot of the 2 women escorting and it made the Harrisburg Capital newspaper. It became news that you had this little place, East Brunswick Township, Spokane, that said thanks but no thanks, and now you can go home now. And it made the point to people that it wasn't just the corporation, that it was actually the state. I mean, the state had sent somebody in on behalf of the corporation to actually shill for the corporation, to push for the corporation. And in fact, public resources paid his gas and his rental car to get there, and paid for his salary when he stood up there and said, we will sue you. And 3 days later, they sued the municipality, and a dozen others over the next couple of months they brought suit, thus making the point for us that we couldn't even make to people, just like with the corporate stuff. It took a response from the system in real time, so that people actually understood how the state was enabling the corporation to do what it did. The problem was not just the corporation, the problem was the governmental system that's operating. Not only just the legal doctrines, but also the fact that the corporations can use the state government at will. I mean, think about our access to be able to do that, right? To be able to get a private attorney general to operate for us in that respect. That doesn't happen. And we're so far away from that it makes it very obvious when it happens on the other side. So what happened next? Well, a township municipality to the west of East Brunswick Township then contacted us and wanted to draft an ordinance that refused to recognize the authority of the Attorney General's office to enforce undemocratic laws, which they were then going to define what an undemocratic law was in terms of this preemption stuff and the Attorney General's office coming in. So we helped them draft that, and then they passed it. It's a little place called Packard Township in Carter County. So there was like this festering revolt starting to happen. It was small, still is small, but disparate communities trying to deal with this stuff. But an understanding by us, because we're really at its root just a resource base and a catalyst in some ways. That's what we do. We don't go into communities unless we're called and people need help with something. And so we come in and we explain how the system operates to people, because nobody understands how the system operates. Yesterday I was talking to folks about the fact that if Congress passed a law, and it was 4 lines and said, corporations shall have more rights than your communities, and shall have different legal doctrines they can use to sue communities when they act out of line, basically, and violate our rights. Congress had that 4-sentence thing on the books as a statute. I think there'd be a revolution in this country. I actually do, because it would be so crystal clear. The reason why there's not is because it's so complex. It's been built like layers of sedimentary rock, these different doctrines that very few people understand. And so you've got 8,000 different things operating that people just have pieces of, but don't understand how the whole system operates. Because when you look at the whole systems approach, it's very clear that we don't live in a democracy. Right? We don't really have decision-making control over almost anything. And so our activism is very anemic. It's about assuming that we live in a democracy and trying to mobilize large numbers of people to do X, Y, and Z. Pressure politics, which we've gotten, has been our mode of operating. But, the idea of actually exercising democracy as the collective people in this country has become so radical a notion that nobody even really raises it anymore. And in fact, the two camps, the conservatives and the liberals, at least to me, there's very little difference between the two. They both distrust majorities at the community level to make any decisions whatsoever. They're about putting into office those folks that are consistent with their values. But democratic control scares the bejesus out of them, the leaders in both political spectrums. And so in Pennsylvania, this little revolt started to happen. And, we started to chuckle because, it was not progressive liberals, it was really conservative Republicans. And so it was tough for folks in the legislature and the corporations to make them out as just tree huggers. They were doing X, Y, and Z. These were, other kinds of people. Anyway, the work then at that point started to spread. And it spread first to New England, so outside Pennsylvania to New England. In New England, they were facing off against water withdrawal companies like Nestle and a company called USA Springs Corporation that wanted to come in and stick a straw in their ground and draw out their aquifer, mostly for overseas bottling operations, to sell bottled water in Italy. That was the plan, was to label it and then sell it after it's extracted. And so communities there said, well, wait a minute, we don't want our aquifer taken by Nestle or these other companies. And so we helped them draft a series of anti-corporate water withdrawal ordinances that banned corporations from withdrawing water from within their municipalities. And that was passed. And not just passed by elected officials, but up there they had a town meeting, which is everybody shows up on one day and they vote on these things. So, sounds great. And so everybody shows up, and by almost unanimous votes, passed those into law in New Hampshire. In Maine, the story was even more amazing. Nestle had put in test wells that nobody knew about. They'd actually drilled test wells in a wildlife refuge that nobody knew about. So folks are hiking out in the wildlife refuge, and they come across these wells. This is how the whole thing started. And then they talked to the town government. The town government said, yeah, those are Nestle wells. They put this in, blah, 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 blah. And started a furor in the community. Nobody knew about them. Nobody wanted Nestle there. And so they passed the corporate water withdrawal ordinance at the town meeting. And Nestle was actually pulled up the test wells, keeping in mind that a lot of times corporations don't want to tangle with these things because they're new beasts. They are local Bill of Rights ordinances that actually have new civil, political, and economic and environmental rights in them, and then have a prohibition as a prohibition of the rights of the people who live in the community. So when they pass these kind of things and the corporations come in, it's not like a regulatory battle where they can hire their experts to testify about parts per million or water pollution or odor pollution or particulates or those types of things, which they've gotten really good at over the past 50 years. But instead it becomes a battle of rights versus rights. And we don't use the phrase anymore for obvious reasons, but it's like creating a tar baby where they stick their hand in and they can't get it back out. Because every time they try to torch it, it actually is a tool for our organisms. Just like we couldn't convince folks to pay attention to corporate rights or the state government's participation in corporate enabling. In this situation, it's about every community beginning to watch real time as what they've driven into law as a Bill of Rights of Sustainability in some ways for their community is then attempted to be dismantled by the very corporations that are trying to drive unsustainable projects into those communities. And so in New England now, there are other projects. The Northern Pass, which is a plan to wheel energy down from Quebec to the East Coast. You have communities now actually passing sustainable energy ordinances, which ban all unsustainable energy transmission through their community. And those laws have been passed. There's something called the East-West Corridor in Maine just last week. The town of Sangerville and probably 24 other towns along the route are now trying to stop a private highway that the state of Maine is licensing to cross from the east-west part of the state. It's going to be a toll road, and it's actually being put in by entirely private investor capital. Not only to bring tar sands oil across, but also fracked gas and using it as a utility corridor for private utility stuff. And so that's what those folks are doing. In Pennsylvania, Ohio, and New York, the big issue is fracking for natural gas. And it was out of that context, out of the growth of those prior 100 communities that came before them, that the city of Pittsburgh contacted us, and the city of Pittsburgh became our client. And the city of Pittsburgh folks, a couple city council members, said, hey, we want you to help us draft an ordinance here in the city of Pittsburgh to ban oil and gas extraction within the city. And we want to do it as a Bill of Rights, that people have a right to a sustainable energy future, and that the prohibition is to prohibit oil and gas drilling within the community. And the city of Pittsburgh added in something which other communities are adding in, which is the rights of nature stuff, which is that ecosystems under our system of law currently are property. We own them. When you own a piece of property, it carries with it the legal authority to actually destroy the ecosystems on that piece of property. So we have a system of law under which the more property you can own, the more ecosystems you can destroy. That's what the environmental protection laws are based on, in essence, in this country. And so some folks have said that doesn't sound right to me, and the way that environmental laws work doesn't seem right either, and so we're actually going to declare within our communities through passing law that nature and ecosystems are not property anymore, that they actually have independently enforceable legal rights of their own, and that community members can step into the shoes of those ecosystems to actually protect them. And it's always hard to get our brain around sometimes what that actually means. But the work in Pennsylvania got picked up by the Ecuadorians, who invited us into the Ecuadorian Constitutional Convention because they wanted to build on what those folks had done and actually put something into their own constitution. And so we worked with that process. The people of Ecuador ratified the Constitution in 2008, becoming the first country in the world to adopt a rights-based environmental protection system at the national level. And in fact, we just had the first 4 cases decided under that law. And I'm going to share that with you and then close up here. The first case in Ecuador that was brought under the rights of nature laws was titled as the case caption because the law allows ecosystems to bring actions on their own. It was entitled the Vilcabamba River versus the City of Loja. So the ecosystem itself was a plaintiff in the case. Okay? And the case involved the local province dumping gravel into the river, changing the river's course. Folks that lived along the course of the river decided to bring suit in the name of the river. The judge decided in favor of the river and ordered restoration for the river to be paid to bring it back to whole from where it was before the construction had begun. Another case dealt with illegal gold mining. The Ecuadorian government has actually used the rights of nature stuff to shut some things down within the country of Ecuador. And so there's some case law being developed around the rights of nature stuff. I'll say there is a lot happening, not just on the East Coast. The first county in the United States, Moore County, banned oil and gas ago through their county commissioners who voted to do so, who also voted to recognize the rights of nature and voted to put in a Bill of Rights at the municipal level. The work that's happening in Oregon is particularly fascinating to me. The folks in Bend and Lane County who have now put forward a Bill of Rights for sustainable agriculture, in essence, within their municipalities, and put a GMO ban as part of that sustainability Bill of Rights. And so there's a lot of new activism starting to happen, folks breaking free of the old shell and moving into new things. And people ask us, where is all this headed, right? And we say, we don't know. It's going to head wherever the people doing the work take it. That's the easiest answer. But the fact is, in 5 states now, there are enough communities that have come together, that have passed these ordinances and local laws, and have come together, stitched themselves together to form statewide organizations. And just a couple weeks ago in Oregon, you had the birth of the Oregon Community Rights Network. A statewide network that's actually going to begin to drive state constitutional change, with an understanding that these doctrines that control the box that we're in actually can only be derailed or gotten rid of, both through the state constitutional change, but also through federal constitutional change. And so next year, for the first time, these state community rights networks are going to gather. People meeting each other for the first time from different states to actually begin to envision what a new federal constitution would look like, or what amendments would look like. So all to say, the question I asked yesterday, at the other presentation was, what are we waiting for? I mean, what exactly are we waiting for? What is left to lose, exactly? I mean, in some ways. And it's time to get off our asses, and we of course have been off our asses for a while, but begin to do work that actually takes the thing over. That actually begins to dismantle these doctrines and builds a whole new system of law. As Derek Jensen, who's one of my favorite authors from the Pacific Northwest, likes to say, he writes in a piece called Forget, it's Giving Up Hope was the name of the piece. I don't know whether people read it, but he said, hope is all about hoping that someone else is going to save you. Whether it's a state agency, or whether it's, Barack Obama, or whether it's, he says some being from Alpha Centaurian, that turning to someone else to try to get someone else to help us, that there's nobody there that's going to help us. And do we actually think that Monsanto is going to stop Monsantoing if we ask them nicely? Saying that it's for us to do. We're the ones that have to do the heavy lifting now, because the system is dangerously off course. And unless we do it, we're cooked. We're going to have to look for another planet if another inhabitable one exists. And so that's where we're at today. So the exciting stuff is, in Oregon, it is coming alive with folks who are now being frontally disobedient to a structure of law that guarantees that their agricultural system is going to be invaded by GMOs. And that work is going to spread, and we hope that you guys decide to become a part of it. Thank you.
Our guest today has been Thomas Linzey, founder of the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund. Learn more about them at CELDF, CELDF.org. And here in Portland, engage with the community rights movement at communityrightspdx.org. Populist Dialogues is a project of the Portland Alliance for Democracy. Learn more about us at afd-pdx.org and our national organization at thealliancefordemocracy.org. We want to thank Roger Bates, Dave King, Brad Leach, Janet Morris, and Tom Thomas for their volunteer time getting us on the air each week, and to all of you for watching. Thank you. I hope you'll watch us again next week. Bye.
If you think corporations bought free speech before, now that they're human, they'll buy even more. Yeah, their money has free speech, to me quite a shock. 'Cause I never heard my money talk. When a corporation has a colonoscopy, then I'll believe they're human like me.